Chapter 1. My name is Cairo. Looking back on my past life, my wife Elena, dissatisfied with the arranged marriage, eloped with her beloved Adrian. On the way, they were involved in a car accident, leaving her legs permanently disabled. I chased after them and rescued her. After that, I stayed by her side without fail, taking meticulous care of her for the rest of her life, and together we raised 3 children. I thought we could live out our days in such a simple, ordinary way, but my wife resented me for the rest of her life. In her old age, she even brought Adrian back to live in our home, saying to me, "If you hadn't meddled back then, Adrian would have been the one to save me. You ruined my love, and I never want to see you again for the rest of my life." Our 3 children also urged me one after another to move into a nursing home and make room for Adrian, saying things like, "Dad, you've had Mom's love for a lifetime, you should be content, you still have us, but Uncle Adrian has no children, he'd be bullied in a nursing home, and Mom doesn't have much time left, just let her have this." I had no choice but to be sent to a nursing home, left alone and helpless. They squandered my pension recklessly, while the whole family lived happily together. Overwhelmed with anger, I suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, became bedridden, and, unable to escape the flood disaster, was tragically drowned. When I opened my eyes again, I had returned to the day my wife pursued love. Since not being with her first love was the regret of her lifetime, I decided to fulfill her wish in this life. "Dad, I want a divorce." Before me, my young wife Elena was angrily confronting her father. The suffocating feeling of being submerged in the flood still lingered in my heart. Filled with confusion, I looked around, taking in the familiar yet strange surroundings, and realized I had been reborn. My father-in-law, seated at the head of the hall, wore an angry expression and softly scolded, "Nonsense." Seeing my long-deceased father-in-law Theodore again, my eyes couldn't help but redden. Abandoned by my family from a young age, it was my father-in-law who picked me up from the streets where I was begging and brought me home. In those days when even having enough to eat was a struggle, he tailored new clothes for me, ensured I had full meals, taught me to read and write, sent me to school, personally guided me in business, and later, when I came of age, welcomed me as his son-in-law, giving me a home. To me, his kindness was as weighty as a mountain. I opened my mouth, about to call out the long unspoken "Master," when Elena beside me let out a furious roar, cutting me off. "Dad, I've never disobeyed you in my life. You made me marry this crude house servant, and I agreed. But not loving someone is just that, I don't love him. He doesn't understand poetry or literature, he's ignorant and vulgar. We have nothing in common. Only Adrian understands me, loves me, respects me. Only with him can I truly experience the feeling of being in love. Mom passed away early, are you really so heartless as to watch me waste half my life with someone I don't love?" These accusations stirred my father-in-law's emotions greatly, but he still suppressed his anger and looked at me apologetically, saying, "Elena is young and mischievous. Don't take her words to heart." I smiled bitterly, thinking to myself that Elena and I already had 3 children, could she still be considered young? Perhaps in a father's eyes, his daughter never truly grows up. Elena's gaze turned to me, her eyes cold and ruthless. "My dad said he raised you to take care of me, but I have hands and feet of my own, and a whole staff of servants. I don't need you at all. There's something I've wanted to say to you for a long time, I've never liked you, not now, and not ever. Cairo, I've made myself perfectly clear. Do you still have the nerve to shamelessly cling to my family?" These familiar words were like a key, unlocking memories I had sealed away for years. I looked at the calendar in disbelief, feeling a wave of dizziness. On this very day in my past life, Elena wanted to give Adrian a proper status and came to talk to my father-in-law about divorce. My father-in-law knew I was a man of deep loyalty and affection. He understood my lifelong admiration for Elena and had witnessed all the care and protection I had given her over the years. In his mind, I was the only suitable son-in-law, so naturally, he refused. When Elena failed to persuade him, she came to pressure me. Back then, I believed my father-in-law's words, thinking she was just spoiled and ignorant. On top of that, I couldn't let go of her or our 3 children, so I didn't agree. In a fit of anger, she ran away from home with Adrian. Not long after they left, they were in a car accident. Her legs were crushed, leaving her permanently disabled. I let go of past grievances and remained by her side, never abandoning her, yet she resented me for refusing to let go, blaming me for causing her disability. She even accused me of taking matters into my own hands to save and care for her, calling me a manipulator who used kindness as leverage to occupy her husband's position, blocking Adrian's only chance to enter her life. In front of family and friends, she only acknowledged Adrian as her first love. As for me, the husband who served her for a lifetime, in her eyes, I was the dregs of an era, a product of feudal ignorance from the older generation, and the eternal sinner who destroyed her love. Since that's the case, in this lifetime, I choose to let go and fulfill her love. Right now, Elena and my father-in-law are still arguing. I sigh softly and say to my father-in-law, since her mind is made up, let's just go along with her wishes. Although Elena and I raised 3 children together, we didn't obtain our marriage certificate until over a decade later. Now, as long as my father-in-law agrees and we tear up the marriage certificate, we will be considered divorced, a simple and quick process. Even after all this, you still won't agree? You useless coward. Elena was halfway through her scolding when she finally grasped what I meant, her voice cutting off abruptly. She gave me a surprised glance, her hostility diminishing slightly as she changed her tone. It's good that you've come to your senses. As long as you behave and listen, I can still remember the contributions you've made to my family and give you a place to stay. Her words were as haughty as ever, just like when we got married, cold, aloof, and unfeeling. I had thought that was just her nature, but after our child was born, she showed a bit more tenderness. Though there was no love between us, we treated each other with respect, much like an ordinary couple. I thought this was fine too. Even without love, we could have friendship, living together, respecting our elders, and raising our child. Perhaps in a few more years, we would understand each other better, develop more rapport, and maybe even grow some affection. Until 6 months ago, when Adrian came to apply for the position of a tutor and was immediately favored by Elena, who specially hired him. Since then, her disgust and disdain for me have reignited, growing stronger by the day. She despises my lack of education, my inability to read foreign literature with her, and only being good at trivial tasks like serving tea, massaging her back, or kneading her shoulders. I learned French specifically to have a common language with her. French was really difficult, and I finally mastered it after much effort. I even secretly read many French literary works, hoping to surprise her. But when I walked to her door with a book, I saw her sitting with Adrian, happily discussing a book together. I couldn't help but stop in my tracks. Adrian whispered something in her ear, making Elena smile sweetly, a smile she had never given me. Feeling utterly disheartened, I was just about to leave when I heard Adrian ask her in French, between me and Kairos, who matters more to you? Elena answered without a moment's hesitation, of course, you matter more to me. You are my soulmate, while Kairos is just a product of my father's old-fashioned thinking, an arranged marriage. I felt as if I had fallen into an icy abyss. We had known each other since childhood, become husband and wife, raised children together, and honored our elders, yet all of this combined couldn't compare to Adrian's sudden appearance. I knew she didn't love me, but I never imagined I would be so worthless in her heart that she wouldn't even hesitate. Elena had no idea I was outside the door. She continued to chatter away, criticizing me for being unromantic, unprogressive, rigid, and boring. This was the first time I clearly realized just how vast the gap is between being loved and not being loved. From that day on, I never mentioned to Elena that I had learned French for her, because to someone who doesn't love me, no amount of effort holds any meaning. I couldn't help but recall all the efforts I had made in the past that went unappreciated. I studied cuisines from around the world to please her, only for her to complain about the smell of cooking oil on me. I searched far and wide, asking friends to bring imported perfumes just to make her happy, yet she snatched my men's cologne and gave it to Adrian, saying, only someone as educated and well-read as him deserves such high-end things. Adrian casually folded a paper flower and gave it to her, saying in a refined tone, flowers are meant for beauties. She lowered her head with a coy smile, overjoyed. I planted a backyard full of roses for her, under the sunlight, thousands of blossoms bloomed, breathtakingly beautiful. Yet she mocked me for being a clumsy imitator, like a clown, and said it made her feel ashamed. In her eyes, Adrian could do no wrong, just a few sweet words meant he had tasted and truly loved her. But everything I did was wrong, even my breathing would draw her scorn, saying I was as loud as an ox, that I shouldn't stay at home but should go live in a cowshed. She held a bias against me in her heart, believing Adrian was her perfect lover. Little did she know, there aren't that many soulmates in this world. Those seemingly perfect partners are either settling for less or part of a carefully crafted scheme. No one is flawless. The more perfect someone appears, the more likely it is a trap tailored just for you. In my previous life, during the time they abandoned me in a nursing home, I resented, struggled, and went to great lengths to uncover evidence of Adrian's hypocrisy, how he swindled money from people everywhere. But the timing was off. When they saw it, they dismissed it as me slandering Adrian and even shared what I told them with him as a joke. They had no defenses against Adrian, so Adrian became more wary of me and started bribing the nursing home staff to abuse me. Just as I would fall asleep at night, the staff would create noise to startle me awake. During meals, my food would always contain onions and dried shrimp, to which I am allergic. I pleaded with them for help time and again, but they dismissed it as me putting on an act, growing increasingly annoyed with me. In the end, they angrily accused me of why I had to make things difficult for someone as kind as Adrian. After this argument, they began avoiding me, trying their best not to speak with me. In the nursing home, the treatment of residents who had visitors and those who didn't was completely different. Seeing that my family no longer contacted me, the staff became even more brazen in their abuse, escalating from feigning carelessness to openly beating and insulting me. I began to go hungry, being roughly shoved by the staff, leaving me bruised all over. Due to long-term malnutrition and emotional distress, I suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, became paralyzed, and was unable to escape the flood disaster, ultimately drowning to death. It could be said that it was my wife and children, whom I had loved with all my heart, who indirectly caused my death. Recalling these past events again, I still feel resentful, and a sense of grievance wells up in my heart. It wasn't until my father-in-law spoke up, breaking the silence and pulling me back to reality. Cairo, don't act impulsively. After all, you two still have 3 children. What will happen to them if you divorce? Upon hearing this, Elena finally smiled. Dad, don't worry. The children are all sensible, and like me, they prefer Adrian. If you don't believe me, I'll call them in to tell you themselves. Soon after, the children came in, accompanied by the refined and cultured Adrian. Seeing this, my father-in-law became furious. Get out. This is a family meeting, not something an outsider like you can interfere in. Before my father-in-law could even start to drive him away, my eldest son stepped in front of Adrian. Uncle Adrian is not an outsider. The second son sniffled and pleaded, Grandpa, we were the ones who insisted on bringing Uncle Adrian. Please don't make him leave, okay? The little girl in Adrian's arms pointed her tiny finger at me angrily and said, I don't want this stinky beggar. I only want Uncle Adrian to be our dad. Even though I had long known this would be the outcome, seeing the children I had raised with my own hands siding with an outsider and humiliating their biological father still filled my heart with a bitter ache that was hard to put into words. I looked at them helplessly, and the children shrank back a step, quickly hiding the candy in their hands, afraid I would notice. No wonder they all liked Adrian so much. It turned out Adrian indulged all their bad habits. They often complained of toothaches, so for their own good, I strictly controlled their sugar intake. Under my strict supervision, none of them ever had a cavity. But when they grew up, they wrote essays blaming me for being too strict. Whether your teeth are good or not is all genetic. My classmates ate candy like it was a meal since they were kids and never brushed their teeth, yet they were perfectly fine. But my dad never bought us candy, and if he caught us not brushing our teeth, we'd get a beating. Who understands the pain of a dysfunctional family? It's normal for children not to understand the intentions of adults, but saying such things after growing up is simply ungrateful. Thinking this, I pretended not to see it and decided I wouldn't interfere with them anymore. Adrian glanced at me smugly, then gently scolded them, you mustn't be disrespectful to your elders. If you do this again, Uncle won't like you anymore. The children instantly became well-behaved. Elena raised an eyebrow and said, Dad, you saw it too. Cairo is a rude man who only uses brute force with the children. They're all afraid of him. Unlike Adrian, who educates the children with the most scientific methods, he's more suited to be their father. My father-in-law, who had strongly opposed before, now fell silent. He only had Elena as his daughter, and with the special bond between grandparents and grandchildren, these 3 children were his heart and soul. For him, nothing was more important than these 3 children. Elena then turned to me and said, Cairo, you're just a son-in-law who married into the family. After the divorce, all 3 children will stay with me. Do you have any objections? The children watched me warily, afraid that I might take them away. I smiled and nodded, saying, that's reasonable. I have no objections. The memories from my past life haven't faded yet, and I have no desire to take care of these 3 children. Since they all want to stay with their mother, it saves me the trouble. My father-in-law looked on helplessly and could only nod in agreement. When the marriage contract was brought out, he hesitated for a moment again. He looked at Elena and said solemnly, there was never any proof of your marriage to begin with. Once this contract is torn, it's truly over between you. Think carefully, are you sure you won't regret this? Without a moment's hesitation, Elena snatched the marriage contract. I never regret the decisions I make. The entire room fell silent, with only the sound of the marriage contract being torn apart. My father-in-law seemed to have aged 10 years in an instant. He looked at me and sighed deeply. I've taught you for many years. Whether you're my son-in-law or not, the company is still yours to manage. I'm old and tired. Elena, who had been in a good mood, immediately became displeased upon hearing this. Adrian has a higher education and is more suitable to be the leader than Cairo. You may not know, but Adrian studied business while abroad. The reason he came back to be a tutor is simply because he hasn't met a mentor who recognizes his talent, leaving his abilities with no outlet. Elena wasn't just trying to deceive her father-in-law, she genuinely believed Adrian was a hidden gem. But in this day and age, how many unrecognized talents are there? True gold shines wherever it goes, unless it's just iron in disguise. Her father-in-law remained silent, lost in thought. He had always doted on his daughter, but he knew little about Adrian's capabilities and naturally hesitated to entrust his lifelong efforts to him so easily. Seeing her father-in-law's silence, Elena, for reasons unknown, suddenly looked up and glared at me fiercely before turning back to him and saying, "Don't doubt me. The highly profitable project from last quarter was actually led by Adrian. It's just that you've always disapproved of our relationship, so he was afraid you wouldn't agree and chose to work behind the scenes without taking credit. Dad, I assure you, if we let Adrian take charge, he will definitely expand the business nationwide and even globally in the future. We aim to become the strongest entrepreneurs in the world, ensuring your name as the founder is remembered for generations." My father-in-law's eyes lit up, clearly intrigued. "Really?" Elena subtly nudged me with her foot, signaling me to stay quiet, then added, "It's true, Dad. Don't you remember after that project ended, Cairo didn't attend the celebration dinner, but I brought Adrian instead? It was because Adrian had contributed significantly, which is why I took him." I frowned. Before the celebration dinner, I had suddenly come down with a severe stomachache, so painful that I couldn't even get up, and ultimately had to miss the event. I couldn't help but recall how, just before the dinner, Elena had surprisingly shown me a bit of kindness, even personally bringing me a bowl of sweet soup, saying it would help settle my stomach and make it easier to handle the drinks at the banquet. She rarely showed such consideration. At that time, my emotions were mixed, and I thought she might have had a change of heart, so I drank half the bowl in front of her. Afterward, she surprisingly didn't scold me for my absence and even asked about my condition several times, showing genuine concern. It turned out she had intentionally drugged me to pave the way for Adrian. The only bit of care I received in years of marriage was actually for another man. My father-in-law had already stepped down years ago, leaving the company's affairs to the two of us. Now that she could lie to him so easily, she must have already prepared false evidence. Even if I told the truth, it would be useless. In my previous life, she must have prepared this move as well, but my father-in-law didn't agree to the divorce, so she never had the chance to use it. My father-in-law looked at me. "Cairo, what do you think?" I tugged at the corner of my mouth, recalling how in my previous life, after Elena became disabled, my father-in-law would constantly use the fact that I took care of her as leverage, pressuring her to give up the idea of divorcing and remarrying. Feeling indebted to Adrian, Elena brought him into the company, and it wasn't long before I was sidelined and he took control. Yet none of the grand promises she made came true. In less than a year, all the businesses were ruined by Adrian. My father-in-law's lifelong efforts were destroyed in an instant, and the entire family was left burdened with massive debt. "I'm sorry, it was my incompetence that harmed you. I can't face you again in this lifetime." Adrian pretended to be ashamed, but in reality, he had transferred the assets and happily fled. Elena, however, took his lies to heart, spending her days in tears and staying up late every night writing letters filled with longing for him. She never stopped to think, if he truly felt guilty, why didn't he come back to share the burden of the debt instead of running away? Her father's lifelong efforts were ruined in an instant, yet she showed no concern for him, instead finding the time to pine for someone else. Watching my wife, whose heart belonged only to others, I had long wanted to end things. But just as I was planning to divorce, my father-in-law could no longer hold on. This wise man, who had lived a sensible life, fell from the heights to the depths in his later years because of his daughter's foolishness. His hair turned white overnight, and he aged rapidly. I had no choice but to set aside the divorce and devote a great deal of energy to finding doctors, buying good medicine, and carefully caring for my father-in-law. This delay lasted for several months. Because of her father's illness, my wife settled down, and we lived in harmony, taking care of the elderly man together. However, the immense blow shattered the kind old man's spirit, and his health ultimately deteriorated beyond recovery. Before leaving, he clutched my hand tightly, tears streaming down his aged face as he pleaded, "Cairo, I've spoiled this daughter of mine, and you've suffered for it. But she is, after all, my only child. I beg you, for the sake of all these years of affection, take good care of her, so that I can rest in peace and go meet her mother, who died too soon." Chapter 2. I could never repay his kindness in raising me, so with tears in my eyes, I agreed, enduring all the hardships that followed. After that, I worked to earn money while taking care of Elena and supporting our 3 children, living a life of hardship. A few years later, I seized an opportunity and founded my own company. Before long, I paid off all our debts, allowing them to continue living a life free from worry about food and clothing. Having experienced the hardships brought by poverty, the children seemed to have grown much more sensible and no longer chanted Adrian's name along with my wife. My wife gradually calmed down as well, and the atmosphere between us returned to the simple warmth we had when our child was first born. I thought everything was back on track and immersed myself in the happiness of life, showering our 3 children with extra affection. No matter how tired I was from work, I made time every day to care for my wife, cleaning her body, combing her hair, and dressing her up. In certain moments, she would even hold my hand affectionately and say, "It's so good to have you by my side." But more often than not, she would still sit alone in the room, silently gazing out the window. Outside the window were the roses I had planted for her in the yard years ago. I thought she was too lonely, so I made time every day to take her for walks in the garden. I even hired a renowned landscape designer at great expense to transform the garden into a breathtakingly beautiful space, with flowers and plants blooming in every season. Every time the roses bloom in abundance, her mood always seems a bit strange, yet she insists on going out to see the flowers. I find it a little odd, but I'm afraid of upsetting her, so I haven't dared to ask too deeply. Until one day, I saw half a sheet of stationery on her desk, on which was written, "Spring is half gone," and the sight of it breaks my tender heart. I thought she was lamenting her youth that would never return, resenting her inability to walk again, unable to step into the spring breeze herself, so I felt even more pity for her. Now, looking back, she wasn't pitying her fleeting youth at all, she was clearly missing that separated lover, Adrian. Her tender heart broken by the sight, wasn't because of the garden I built for her, but because the roses in the garden reminded her of the paper rose Adrian once gave her, right? How laughable, a piece of scrap paper could surpass a garden full of spring light and years of companionship. What's even more laughable is that I was completely unaware of all this. This seemingly harmonious and warm family had been silently guarding a shared secret in places I knew nothing about. After the children graduated, I stepped down and left the company to them, thinking that after a lifetime of hard work, I could finally enjoy my retirement in peace. Little did I know, they would bring Adrian back home once again. Dad, Uncle Adrian didn't mean to do it back then, he was just deceived. Besides, he's been filled with guilt, eating vegetarian for years, and his health has deteriorated. Do you really have to hold a grudge against him until death? It was only then that I realized my wife had never forgotten Adrian. At some point, without my knowledge, they had reconnected with Adrian behind my back, and even knew that he had been, filled with guilt, eating vegetarian for years. Not only did they urge me to be magnanimous, but they also wanted to drive me to a nursing home to provide for Adrian in his old age. It's not that the family can't afford to support 3 elderly people, but Mom's health is getting worse and worse, and she goes crazy every time she sees you. That's right. After Adrian appeared, my wife's attitude toward me grew increasingly worse, from chatting and laughing to treating each other with respect, then to glaring coldly, and finally starting to curse at me whenever she saw me, saying I had ruined her love. But why should she go crazy at me? I've taken care of her all these years, helped her family pay off debts, cared for the elderly and raised the children together with her, and even after learning that she had another man in her heart, I let it go for the sake of my father-in-law. In what way have I let her down? She doesn't have many years left to live, and her only wish is to be with the first love she once missed. Aren't you even willing to fulfill that? Dad, you're just too selfish. Uncle Adrian is so pitiful, with no children or grandchildren. If he's sent to a nursing home, won't he be bullied to death? Dad, you still have us. Your hardship is only temporary, and we will definitely bring you home and compensate you 100-fold. How laughable. They know that the elderly might be bullied in nursing homes and can't bear to send Adrian there, yet they have no problem sending me. I didn't want to go, but I had already handed over the financial control to my children. I couldn't even tell whether they were here to persuade me or to notify me. I looked around the room, my children, my wife, all people I had genuinely cared for, but not a single one stood by my side. Helpless, I turned my pleading gaze toward my wife, but she averted her face and refused to look at me. I finally understood my situation. I was, voluntarily, sent to the nursing home, hoping that these 3 children would keep their word and at least visit me often. But what I ended up waiting for was their happy, harmonious family life, while I met a tragic end, dying in a flood. Thinking of this, I nodded and said, "She makes a good point. Adrian has a higher education and is more suitable than a rough guy like me." My answer satisfied everyone present. After a moment of joy, my father-in-law composed himself, looked at me with a hint of guilt, and instructed the housekeeper, "Prepare the best guest room for Cairo." Just as I was about to refuse, Adrian interrupted, "They're already divorced. It wouldn't be appropriate for Cairo to stay at home, would it?" My father-in-law couldn't bear the thought. "I've raised him for many years and have long considered him half a son. What's wrong with him staying at home?" Elena was also a bit hesitant, but seeing Adrian biting his lip, she immediately made a decision. "Adrian is right, it's not appropriate for an outsider to live at home. Isn't it just that you feel you have no son to take care of you in your old age? Adrian will marry into our family, and from now on, he will be your son. As for taking care of you in your old age and handling funeral arrangements, Cairo won't be needed anymore." Hearing this, I also nodded and looked at the old man, addressing him with a title I hadn't used since getting married, "Master. Over the past 20 years, I have dedicated myself wholeheartedly to this family, never daring to slack off even for a moment. Taking over the group from you, I transformed it from a small company into the top enterprise in the province, with branches spread across major cities nearby, generating billions in revenue for the family. Today, I say this not to boast, but only to repay the kindness of your upbringing and guidance." I bowed deeply to him once more. "Master, I'm leaving now. Don't worry about me." The old man's eyes reddened. He glanced at Elena and finally gave a slight nod. At that moment, I knew I had truly bid farewell to my past life. As for Elena's future, let her go her own way. In this second chance at life, my greatest realization is that everyone has their own chosen fate, and I must learn to respect the fate of others. This is not resentment, nor is it mockery, it is simply respect. Forcibly interfering in someone else's fate means taking on their karma, and it will drag your own destiny into the abyss. I turned to leave, but Adrian called out to me again, "Wait, since you said we're even, you shouldn't take anything from the house, including all the gifts others gave you." He raised an eyebrow, his eyes filled with smugness and glee, which filled me with disgust. I instinctively glanced at the gold watch on my wrist. Of everything I had on me, this watch was the most valuable, a gift from my father-in-law not long ago, when he saw how Elena had been neglecting me. I began to take it off. Just then, the children's innocent voices chimed in, "Uncle Adrian, is that really necessary? What could he possibly have, besides that old watch? That's a fake. The real watch was swapped out by Mom and given to you long ago. What a country bumpkin, can't even tell real from fake, wearing a counterfeit every day and flaunting it around, it's downright embarrassing." The children's scornful laughter was especially clear. Elena's face instantly changed, and she hurriedly said, "The child was just talking nonsense in their sleep, don't take it seriously." Adrian pretended to be hot and rolled up his sleeve, but he was actually showing off the watch on his wrist. He hypocritically lectured, "You're mistaken. The watch I'm wearing is the fake one." But anyone with eyes could see that his watch was gleaming gold, while the gold plating on mine had already faded. My wife awkwardly turned her head away, not daring to look at me. My father-in-law angrily slapped the table and asked loudly, "Is it true?" My wife lowered her head and said nothing. In front of her father, she knew what she had done was unreasonable, but she couldn't argue back because the authenticity of the watch would be clear once it was examined. Her attitude alone made it obvious that it was true. My father-in-law said with deep disappointment, "You really don't know what's good for you. At the time, Cairo was still your husband, and you never once gave him a gift. Even the gift I gave him to comfort him, you had to take it away." My wife muttered softly, "Anyway, it was meant for your son-in-law. In my heart, I only consider Adrian my husband. What's wrong with giving it to him?" My father-in-law was so angry he could barely catch his breath. "Do you even realize you were still married at the time? Don't you understand the most basic duties of a spouse? How did I raise you to be like this?" Seeing her father's anger, my wife lowered her head and stopped arguing back, though her expression still brimmed with defiance. I smiled bitterly. In truth, it wasn't that I couldn't tell the difference between real and fake, I simply thought my father-in-law had casually bought me a watch, so I had cherished it all along. But I never expected that the watch my father-in-law gave me was genuine, it was just swapped out by Elena. Her favoritism toward Adrian had reached such an extreme. I removed all the accessories from my body, the fake watch, the silver ring, and the pen my father-in-law gave me when I first took charge of the company. I looked at Adrian and asked, "Now, can I leave?" He still raised an eyebrow and said, "When you first arrived, you had nothing. You should leave the same way. If it weren't for Elena's family's kindness, giving you food and work, you would have starved on the streets. How could you afford to wear these clothes?" The children watched the scene with glee. My father-in-law couldn't hold back his anger and snapped, "He's already left everything behind. It's just a few pieces of clothing, do you have to make him take those off too? This is going too far." Even Elena, who has always had issues with me, opened her mouth and said, "Going out like this would be disgraceful and not very appropriate. My family isn't short of money for a set of clothes. Considering how diligently he has worked all these years, let's just forget it." Adrian immediately looked aggrieved, gazing at Elena with resentment and saying, "You still care about him in your heart. It seems that what you said earlier about loving only me was all a lie." "I'm sorry, Elena, but I have a mental purity complex and can't accept you loving two people. Come find me again when you've completely forgotten about him." After saying that, he walked out without looking back. Elena immediately grew anxious, quickly ordered someone to follow through, and hurriedly chased after him. I understood in my heart that Adrian wasn't an impulsive person, he did this to completely drive me away and eliminate any future trouble. Only by humiliating me and making me leave would I be too ashamed to ever return, and Elena would no longer be able to maintain any lingering ties with me. But Elena couldn't see it. A sincere person wouldn't play such underhanded little tricks, nor would they use her feelings to blackmail her. If someone tried to use her feelings to blackmail her as soon as they got together, it was easy to imagine what they might do to her once they had gained some benefit. But she was so focused on Adrian that she never gave it much thought. Outside the window, the sun was blazing brightly. I glanced at the wall clock in the living room, it was exactly 14:40. Adrian had no idea that his little outburst coincided with the exact moment in their previous life when they had run away from home together. I wonder if Elena will have an accident this time. If she ends up disabled, will Adrian, as she hopes, take care of her for the rest of her life and treat their children well? Before I could think further, the bodyguard stood in front of me. "Mr. Cairo, we have to make a living too. Please don't make things difficult for us." My father-in-law wanted to speak, but I shook my head. He has a point. "What I owe you, I've repaid today." I began unbuttoning my shirt, and everyone else turned away. When it was all over, a worker I had once helped couldn't bear it and handed me a coat to cover myself. I smiled at him, "Thank you." As soon as I stepped outside, the neighbors saw me being driven out and began pointing and whispering, mocking me, calling me foolish and ridiculous. What did past glory matter? Now I had ended up being thrown out of my own home. But I was not disturbed by their words, and I left with my head held high. They didn't understand, the old me lived under the weight of heavy gratitude, but now, this is my new life. Just as I stepped out of the alley, Elena was following Adrian's direction when suddenly, a loud crash echoed. I sighed and turned to leave. Why doesn't this person watch where they're going, rushing around like that? Oh my, both legs have been crushed, how will they live from now on? Isn't this Theodore's only daughter, Elena? She's been pampered her whole life, and now she's going to be disabled for life. How could she possibly accept that? The chatter from the people around grew louder, and Elena snapped back to awareness from the excruciating pain. Chapter 2. She looked around in confusion, her expression filled with bewilderment. The buildings were old and low, nothing like the towering skyscrapers that would dominate in the years to come. How strange, the street scene looked as if it were from decades ago. At this thought, Elena shuddered, suddenly realizing something. She hurriedly looked at her hands. The skin was fair and firm, clearly that of a young person. No matter how well she had taken care of herself in her later years, her skin had never been this firm. Only then did she realize that she seemed to have been reborn, and had returned to her youth. She still had a bright future ahead, and a chance to change her fate, to be with Adrian. A sharp pain shot through her leg, and she realized she had been reborn at the exact moment of the car accident. It was a bit late, but not too late. Cairo hadn't come to rescue her yet. She still had a chance to make up for the regrets of her past life. She recalled her past life. In her previous existence, after a car accident, she was saved by Cairo. Although Cairo was the one who rescued her, it was Adrian who stayed by her side during those difficult years after her injury, offering encouragement and support. She became increasingly aware of her own feelings. Love cannot be forced. She could no longer bear her dull husband, who only ever asked what she wanted to eat, and decided to divorce him. However, her old-fashioned father refused. Elena, one must have a conscience. For the sake of your legs, Cairo sought medical help everywhere, even kneeling before others. At home, he endured your insults and abuse, tirelessly tending to your needs, cleaning your wounds, and caring for you. Out of gratitude for his kindness, you must never divorce him in this lifetime. Her father constantly spoke of loyalty and had never liked Adrian. Filled with anger, she openly wrote letters expressing her longing for Adrian in front of Cairo, blatantly provoking him. As expected, Cairo could no longer bear it and began to consider divorce. But at this time, her father fell ill. She knew the cause of his illness. Half of it was due to Adrian's bad luck, which had ruined the family business and destroyed half a lifetime of her father's hard work. The other half was his worry for her. She didn't want to upset her father, so she didn't dare to cause any more trouble. But even so, her father's condition did not improve, and he eventually passed away. Before his death, her father asked Cairo to take good care of her. Because of her father's dying wish and her own quiet behavior during this time, Cairo continued to live with her. Later, Cairo achieved success in his career, paid off her family's debts, and provided a good life for her and their 3 children. Cairo treated her very well, taking care of her in every possible way, and she almost accepted this kind of life. Only occasionally would she feel melancholy, knowing that the person by her side was not the one in her heart. There was always a chasm between them. Just when she had finally accepted this life, accepted growing old with someone she didn't love, Adrian contacted her again. She didn't want to reconnect with Adrian, but she couldn't resist his repeated pleas and eventually agreed to listen to him say 3 final words. Who would have thought that this conversation would completely overturn her understanding? It turned out that in her previous life, Adrian had intended to come to save her, but that scoundrel Cairo had beaten him to it. Later, when she was hospitalized, Cairo prevented Adrian from visiting her. Moreover, he whispered lies into her father's ear, making her father believe that Adrian was a heartless and ungrateful villain, thus doing everything he could to sabotage their relationship. Adrian didn't want to stir up conflict between her and her father, so he endured everything in silence, bearing her misunderstandings. That was why they had missed so many years together. Cairo had indeed been good to her, but she never needed that kind of goodness. Adrian loved her just as much and would have treated her just as well. Instead, Cairo, in his desire to have her, exploited her father's trust, causing her and Adrian to miss each other for years, lose their love, and waste half her life. Perhaps heaven took pity on her, which is why it gave her a chance to start over, to correct her mistakes and fight for her love once more. However, she frowned as she looked at her leg. The timing of her rebirth wasn't ideal, it happened right after her car accident. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had returned to her youth and had the opportunity to reclaim her love. That was more than enough. The most important thing now was to not give Cairo the chance to save her, to prevent him from using the favor and debt of rescuing her to come between her and Adrian again. She was terrified that Cairo might appear to save her, leading her down the same tragic path as in her previous life. Anxiously, she scanned her surroundings, and only when she didn't see Cairo anywhere did she finally feel at ease. The driver was terrified and quickly called for passers-by to help. Elena grew frantic again, waving her arms and shouting, "Don't touch me. I only want Adrian to save me. All of you, get away from me. If someone else were to rescue her, who knows what might go wrong." The driver paused. "Your leg, if we keep delaying like this, I'm afraid." Elena gritted her teeth against the pain. "Don't worry about me. I'll definitely be fine." In her previous life, the doctor had spoken of such grave danger, but in the end, she recovered quite well. Could it be even more severe this time? Her face was pale with pain, yet she stubbornly refused to give in. This time, she was determined to give Adrian the chance to save her, so that her father could no longer find any excuse to keep him from entering the house. In this life, heaven had given her an opportunity, and she absolutely would not let Cairo's treacherous scheme succeed. But what about Adrian? Shouldn't he be by her side? As time passed, Adrian still had not appeared. Elena's injuries grew increasingly severe, and blood continued to flow, staining the ground red. If this dragged on any longer, Elena wouldn't just be crippled, her life would be at risk. The driver was on the verge of tears, terrified that if anything happened to Elena, his own guilt would only deepen. Theodore was known for his generosity, and many had benefited from his kindness. Seeing Elena stubbornly refusing to back down, someone hurried off to find Theodore. Moments later, Theodore arrived, trembling, and nearly fainted at the sight before him. Fortunately, the butler by his side caught him. He wailed, "Cairo, hurry and get someone to lift the car and save my poor daughter." The butler fell silent for a moment. "Sir. Cairo has already left. I'll go call for help right away." Theodore was so accustomed to turning to Cairo whenever something happened that he had forgotten Cairo had been forced to leave. Theodore was stunned for a moment, but his attention ultimately returned to his daughter. "Then get more people to lift the car, and make sure it's quick." Elena had lost too much blood, yet she still managed to retort, "No, no one but Adrian is allowed to save me." Before she could finish speaking, her consciousness faded, and she fell into a deep coma. When she woke again, she was lying in a hospital bed. She called out loudly, "Adrian." No one responded. Elena frowned to herself. What was going on? She had left this opportunity for Adrian, so why hadn't he saved her? Elena looked around, searching for any trace of Adrian, but found none. Instead, she noticed that her elderly father had gained even more white hair. Theodore woke up and looked at his daughter's pale face. His eyes, already swollen from crying, turned red again. He opened his mouth, about to speak. Elena, thinking he would blame Adrian, quickly defended him. "Adrian might not have known I was in trouble, otherwise he would have definitely come to save me." Upon hearing this, Theodore flew into a rage, that heartless, ungrateful wretch. Seeing her father's unwavering disdain for Adrian, Elena was also displeased. "Dad, Adrian not being there was truly just an accident, he had his reasons. On the other hand, Cairo, as my husband, I've been in trouble for so long, and you've already rushed here, but he still hasn't shown up. He's received so much kindness from our family, yet when he saw I was in trouble, he didn't care at all. He's the one who's heartless and ungrateful, and on top of that, he's a thankless person. Are you really willing to entrust your daughter's future to such a petty person? Even now, while you're still here, he's acting so outrageously. Who knows how he'll bully your daughter when times get tough. He's not half as good as Adrian, a gentle and refined scholar who values relationships the most. No matter what you say this time, I am determined to get this divorce." After speaking, a triumphant smile spread across her face, thinking she had it in the bag this time. However, she saw her father looking at her with even more concern and hurriedly said to the doctor, "Please check her brain again. Could it have been damaged in a car accident?" His face was full of worry. Elena, however, was particularly angry. "Dad! What are you talking about? I'm perfectly clear-headed and normal right now." Theodore looked at her and sighed. "But you and Cairo are already divorced. It happened not long before your accident. Don't you remember any of this? You forgot. You kicked Cairo out on the spot and even made him take off his clothes before leaving. You're already divorced, how could he possibly know about your car accident or show up to save you? Divorced? How could Cairo possibly agree to that?" Elena was stunned, but in an instant, she was overjoyed. Yet, she soon grew worried again, wondering if this was all part of Cairo's scheme. Cairo loved her deeply. In her previous life, despite all her tantrums, he never divorced her and took meticulous care of her. She might have forgotten that although Cairo had admired her in his youth, he was not without dignity or entirely dependent on her. In her past life, his unwavering loyalty to her began with pity for her misfortunes, but later it was due to his father's request and a sense of gratitude. She paused and inquired about the details. Upon learning that Cairo had not only agreed to the divorce but also relinquished control of the company, leaving with nothing, she grew suspicious. Then, a thought crossed her mind. Perhaps Cairo had also been reborn and returned earlier than she did. Feeling the emptiness in her legs, she felt a pang of resentment. Since Cairo had known everything all along, why hadn't he stopped her? Why had he allowed her to experience the pain of disability once again? In her heart, she cursed Cairo countless times. In the end, she could only let out a long sigh. So be it. It was for the best that Cairo had left on his own, no longer entangled with her. In this life, she owed Cairo no more favors, and they could live the rest of their lives without any debts to each other. With just a bit more effort, she could make her father fully accept Adrian. What a pity, Adrian must have been so angry that he ran off. If he had saved her back then, she would have had an excuse to convince her father. During the treatment, Adrian returned. He was crying uncontrollably, tears and mucus streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Elena. It's all my fault. If I hadn't gotten angry and run off, this wouldn't have happened to you. It's all my mistake. Why wasn't I the one hit by the car?" He beat his chest in anguish, overwhelmed with grief. Elena had never blamed him in the first place, and hearing this moved her even more. "Don't say that anymore. Natural disasters and accidents can't be blamed on you. It's just a shame, you missed a great opportunity. But as long as you perform well from now on, my father is very soft-hearted. He'll definitely accept you as you wish." She tightly grasped Adrian's hand, completely unaware of the fleeting shrewdness that flashed in his eyes. Chapter 3. After leaving, I temporarily stayed at my friend Michael's place. At that time, I also heard that loud noise, but I didn't stop. In my past life, I saved her, yet she resented me for a lifetime. Now, I also want to see what kind of life she will lead. And I don't want to stay in this city any longer. But if I leave, I have no money. I can only help out at Michael's small shop, doing odd jobs, saving enough money before I leave. Today, a few unexpected guests came to the shop. As usual, I went over and asked if they wanted spicy, but they ignored me while chatting. Thinking that non-spicy noodles could have chili added later, I served a bowl of non-spicy noodles, with a small bottle of chili oil on the tray. The leader of the group, without saying a word, directly splashed the steaming hot noodles on me. "I like spicy food, and you didn't add chili for me. What do you mean by that?" Michael immediately came over to apologize, offering to pay for another bowl. I went back to the kitchen to change my clothes. The hot noodles had splashed onto my skin, and it was now burning painfully. Michael quickly handed me a cold towel. "Apply this cold compress right away. Do you need some burn ointment?" I shook my head. I dodged quickly, "So it's not too serious." What kind of manners do people have these days? They don't even say whether it's spicy or not, and then they get angry when it's served. Michael said indignantly. I shook my head worriedly. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. These people don't seem genuinely angry, they seem more like they're here to pick a fight. Let's be careful for a while." This time, with extra spice added, he flipped the table again, shouting, "Adding so much spice, are you trying to kill me?" They flew into a rage, smashing everything in the shop and scaring away all the other customers. While Michael was lamenting his bad luck, Adrian arrived, surrounded by a group of people. Among them were many familiar faces, people who had once received favors from me and used to bow and scrape at my heels every day. Now, they had all turned to Adrian. Adrian stood before me, still wearing that gentle, spring-like smile, but his words were venomous. "Elena asked me to tell you that if you don't get out of this city, what happened today will repeat itself every single day from now on." I raised an eyebrow slightly, only then realizing that the disruption was orchestrated by Elena. Beside me, Michael stormed out angrily, "So it was you. Cairo, don't believe him. Elena has always been kind-hearted since childhood, she wouldn't do something so malicious. He must be stirring up trouble." Although Elena was love-struck and later did many foolish things for Adrian, causing many friends to drift away from her. But Elena truly wasn't a malicious person. Even though she had been dissatisfied with the marriage arranged by Theodore since childhood, she never did anything to harm me. She even stood up for me when I was bullied by wealthy heirs, having her bodyguards teach them a lesson. This was one of the reasons I later chose to treat her well. Later, when I died in the nursing home, she was indeed an indirect culprit, but she truly had no knowledge of it. Her kindness was the sheltered kind, and her cruelty was born of innocence, both equally unsettling. However, the idea that she would personally orchestrate wrongdoing does seem suspicious, and it's no wonder my brother didn't believe it. I was also puzzled when a cold female voice came through. "Cairo, I'm not a soft-hearted person. If you don't leave, I can do even more extreme things." The crowd parted, and Elena was wheeled in on a wheelchair, accompanied by a doctor. Her face was pale and bloodless, but her eyes were filled with intense malice. Such deep hatred felt strangely familiar to me. Elena seemed different. Michael couldn't believe it and wanted to argue further, but I pulled him aside and nodded. "I'll leave." Elena stared at my intact legs, her eyes suddenly turning red as she lost control. "You knew something would happen to me, yet you didn't stop me, causing me to end up paralyzed. Leave. Why should you get to walk away? Someone, break his legs too, make him just like me." Several bodyguards stepped forward and pinned me down firmly, delivering blow after heavy blow to my legs. The pain spread, and sweat beaded densely on my forehead. I looked up at Elena again, and in her eyes, I saw the triumphant gleam of vengeance fulfilled. Watching her frenzied demeanor and listening to her words, a thought surfaced in my mind: she, like me, had also been reborn. The Elena of the past, though flawed, was kind-hearted. She had always been all talk, never willing to truly harm anyone. But no matter how good-natured a person is, if they spend a lifetime unable to stand up, living each day consumed by hatred, their psyche will inevitably become completely twisted. As my legs were broken, I could no longer hold back my screams of agony. Elena's laughter grew even more maniacal. This person had truly gone mad. Laughing and laughing, suddenly there came a sound of dripping. Yellow liquid dripped from the chair, accompanied by an unpleasant, pungent odor. Having taken care of her for decades, I knew very well that it was because of her partial paralysis and loss of bodily control that she had wet herself. In my previous life, she had also suffered from incontinence, but I took care of her meticulously and tried my best to spare her embarrassment. So, in this life, she still couldn't accept herself in such a state. Elena's laughter abruptly stopped, and the entire room fell silent in an instant. Many frowned, covered their noses, and sneered. Even Adrian was no exception, raising an eyebrow with a hint of disdain. In my past life, I would always kneel on the ground, carefully wiping her clean. She couldn't see my kindness, nor could she see through Adrian's disguise. Elena let out a cry of despair, and Adrian hurried over to comfort her, but it was only empty words. Anyone could tell from his clumsy manner that he had never taken care of Elena before. Yet in Elena's eyes, this person, full of flaws, was seen as a good man. I couldn't help but laugh as I watched their retreating figures, spitting fiercely on the ground. Elena, embarrassed, had no intention of punishing me further. After everyone left, Michael wiped away his tears while speaking up for me, saying, "Elena used to be such a good person. What happened today?" I pushed myself up from the ground, but even the slightest movement sent sharp pains shooting through my legs, causing sweat to bead on my forehead. It was likely a fracture. I replied, "People change. She's not the same Elena anymore. The more triumphant she feels now, the more painful her fall from grace will be later. No matter how much I say, she won't believe it, only first-hand experience will make her realize the truth." Michael exclaimed, "Ouch. I was just talking to you. You need to get to the hospital right away. It was just a fracture, and with proper care, it would heal." But I didn't want to stay any longer. Elena was acting like a madwoman, and it was too dangerous to remain. There was no telling what else she might do. I borrowed some money from Michael and planned to leave as soon as I was discharged from the hospital. During that time, everyone knew I was Elena's ex-husband, and news about her kept reaching me. They actually got married, and they did it by going straight to the Civil Affairs Bureau to register. Back in the day, Elena absolutely refused to get a marriage certificate, so we only signed a marriage contract. Later, we finally registered our marriage because I bought a house, and she was afraid someone else would benefit from it. I shook my head, no longer dwelling on these matters. Someone even showed me their wedding photos. In the pictures, Elena looked completely different from when she was with me. Even sitting in a wheelchair, her face was radiant with a happy smile. Is this what it looks like to marry the one you love? Perhaps. I just wonder how long such good days will last for her. On the day of her wedding, I left my hometown, where I had lived for half my life, riding in a fellow villager's car along the muddy country roads. Chapter 4. Life outside was tough, but by relying on my own hands to find work, I quickly adapted and established myself. A year later, I had saved up some money and started a small business by setting up a street stall. The wound on my leg had long since healed. Looking at the environment so different from the first half of my life and watching the numbers in my bank account steadily increase, I felt more and more at ease. My life had truly taken a brand new path. One day, the owner of the small shop told me there was a phone call for me. Back then, it wasn't like later when everyone had a mobile phone and making calls was convenient. I put down what I was doing and walked over, thinking it was Michael calling. I had borrowed quite a bit of money from him when I left, and we had kept in touch, so he was the only one who could be looking for me. But I never expected to hear the tearful, childish voice of a little girl, "Daddy, please come back quickly. Grandpa died, and Uncle Adrian even hit Mom." This was my youngest daughter's voice. My heart tightened sharply. Theodore had been in good health when I left, how could he have passed away in just a year? Before I could speak, my daughter burst into tears. The older son took the phone and told me about their experiences over the past year. After Adrian entered the household, he initially behaved quite obediently, just as usual. Although Theodore didn't have a good impression of him, he couldn't resist Elena's constant persuasion, and Adrian also put on an act for a while. Theodore gradually let his guard down and allowed him into the company. Theodore was getting older and had fallen ill due to Elena's car accident, so his energy was somewhat lacking. He slowly handed over power to Adrian, eventually letting him take full control of the company. On the day he officially took charge, Adrian emotionally grabbed Elena's hand and promised to always treat her well. However, after taking control of the company, he often used work as an excuse not to come home or would return drunk in the early hours of the morning. The beautiful scenes Elena had hoped for did not materialize. She was deeply dissatisfied, but due to her limited mobility, she could only wait at home in anguish. Adrian's work excuses ultimately couldn't deceive Elena. Although Elena had been well protected by her family, she wasn't entirely unaware of the company's situation. Adrian claimed to be busy every day, yet the company's financial condition showed no signs of improvement. One time, when Adrian didn't return home all night, Elena followed him and witnessed him with his arms around other women. He even slurred drunkenly, "Why go home? Going home means facing that cripple. I'd rather stay here and drink with you, beautiful." He was no longer the gentle and refined man Elena had once seen. Reeking of alcohol, he disgusted her. Furious, Elena had a heated argument with Adrian. By then, Adrian had already taken control of the company and didn't take Elena's threat seriously at all. After their confrontation, he became even more brazen, bringing women home without restraint. Naturally, Elena was unwilling to tolerate this, but every time she lost her temper, Adrian would look at her with disdain and say, "I was willing to marry a cripple like you, that's a blessing your ancestors must have earned over 8 lifetimes. Don't be ungrateful." If Elena resisted, Adrian would resort to violence. As a frail woman, half paralyzed, she was no match for him. Beaten, Elena could only seek refuge with her father. Theodore was furious and insisted on teaching Adrian a lesson. However, Adrian not only spoke disrespectfully but had also already seized power, constantly cursing Theodore as an old fool, and even beating Elena right in front of him. Theodore ordered his attendants to intervene, only to realize that during his period of inaction, Adrian had replaced everyone in the household. Helplessly watching his beloved daughter being beaten to the ground, Theodore was powerless, and the rage triggered a cerebral hemorrhage on the spot, leaving him paralyzed. Elena screamed for someone to help and begged Adrian to call a doctor for her father. But Adrian insisted that Theodore was possessed by evil spirits, bringing in charlatans from all over. He had always resented Theodore, having been humiliated by him before the marriage, and secretly wished for his downfall. How could he possibly have any genuine intention to save him? Watching his daughter being bullied and the family being thrown into chaos by a bunch of charlatans, Theodore grew anxious and angry, and soon fell ill and passed away. With the family's pillar gone, Adrian shed his last shred of restraint, completely dropping the pretense of being kind to the children. He stopped giving the children proper meals, forcing them to eat leftover scraps, and only allowed them to wear old clothes. Later, after running the company into the ground, Adrian simply pulled the children out of school, calling them burdens and forcing them to drop out and work to support the family. With no other choice, the 3 children searched everywhere for my contact information, hoping to bring me back. Looking back, when I was in the nursing home, I had called and begged them to take me home, even if just to see me for a moment. Even when the flood came, I was still pleading for help, but not one of them was willing to pay any attention to me. I sat there holding the receiver in a daze, listening to the sounds of their happy, harmonious family on the other end of the line. At my most helpless moment, they were busy competing to get Adrian to eat the dumplings they had made. The agony of drowning in the flood surged back into my heart. This was the father they had chosen for themselves, let them bear the full responsibility for their choice. I suppressed that flicker of softness in my heart and was just about to refuse when a woman's voice came from the other end of the line. "Who told you to beg him? We're doing just fine. Adrian is just being led astray by some woman outside. He still cares about me, about us. If you dare call him again, I'll disown you." The phone was slammed down abruptly. I recognized it, that was Elena's voice. Elena, who had been pampered her entire life, was accustomed to pride and had never learned to humble herself. I let out a light chuckle and didn't dwell on it further. Since I had already decided to let go, I wouldn't concern myself with her anymore. The greatest lesson I learned from my past life was to respect others' destinies. Good advice is wasted on those determined to perish, let her be. It's just that Theodore passed away, and it was after being dragged through a prolonged illness. Even though I had repeatedly told myself to let go, I couldn't help but feel sorrow whenever I thought of that kind old man. My abilities were limited, and they wouldn't have believed me anyway. If I had stayed there, I might have been the first to die. When you have means, you help the world. When you are poor, you focus on improving yourself. I could only prioritize protecting myself first. Chapter 5. In the following years, my career grew larger and larger, and I began to establish a company. Having steered Theodore's enterprise for many years and armed with the experience and informational advantages from my past life, my company developed rapidly from the moment it was founded. As my career progressed, my personal life also fell into place. During a business collaboration, I met the sister of my partner. She was a very gentle girl, with fair skin, a tall figure, and a beautiful smile. We quickly fell in love, got married, and later had a daughter. After marriage, I gained a capable partner, and the company grew even faster. On the day of my daughter's full-month celebration, I even appeared on television due to the company's rapid development. Life was getting better and better, full of hope. But one morning, a group of uninvited guests arrived outside the villa. A madwoman in a wheelchair, accompanied by the media, came to my home and pointed at me, shouting, "What a sham of an entrepreneur. This is nothing but a heartless ingrate who abandoned his wife and child. My family raised him, yet he abandoned us and didn't even attend my father's funeral." Countless cameras were pointed at me, and my assistant hurriedly tried to intervene. Frowning, I looked at the person before me, and after a long moment, I finally recalled a name, Elena. My ex-wife trembled, a flicker of shame crossing her face. It really is Elena. Her hair is disheveled, her whole body is dirty, and she gives off an unpleasant odor, completely different from the young lady I remember. Even in her previous life when she was paralyzed, I took good care of her, keeping her clean, smelling nice, and dressed in fashionable clothes. But now, she has become someone I barely recognize, speaking in a vulgar and aggressive manner, which truly shocks me. She has completely changed. Right before me, 3 frail children kneel like little beggars, pleading desperately, "Dad, we are all your children. You can't abandon us. After you left, we couldn't even go to school anymore and had to go out to work. Look at my hands, I've washed dishes so much that my fingerprints are gone, and my sister has to steal and beg on the streets every day." As soon as they said this, those who didn't know the truth erupted in an uproar, and even the neighbors started pointing fingers at me, saying, "He looks all polished and proper, but who would have thought he's trash who abandoned his wife and children?" Yes, living a good life yourself, in a big house, eating imported food, while letting your wife and child beg. Even willing to abandon your own child, how heartless must you be? Overwhelming criticism came pouring in, but I remained unmoved, looking at Elena and saying, "All of this is what you brought upon yourselves. You can't blame me." Some compassionate media advised me, "Sir, no matter what, they were once your family. Even if they made mistakes, you should give them a chance to turn over a new leaf." Everyone thinks I'm cold-blooded and heartless, but I just smile. The cold-blooded and heartless ones aren't me, it's them. The matter of rebirth is too bizarre, so I didn't go into detail. But even setting aside what happened in my past life, the things they did were outrageous enough. I briefly explained the history between us. When I mentioned how Elena insisted on divorcing me to be with Adrian, that fraud, and how our 3 children mocked me as a beggar, fully supporting Adrian as their new father, everyone's gaze toward Elena and the others shifted. Then, when I brought up the fake watch incident and how they made me strip off my clothes, they all gasped in shock. No matter what, after all I had contributed to their family, being kicked out was one thing, but not even letting me take a single piece of clothing, even enemies wouldn't go that far. Elena's face turned ugly as she desperately defended herself. "I was just talking, it's your own stupidity for actually doing it. How can you blame me for that?" I sneered coldly, "I'm not blaming you. I just want to say that I've repaid your family's kindness. Master was there that day, and he acknowledged it too. So don't even think about using the debt of gratitude to force me to compromise, now or ever." Elena gritted her teeth and fell silent. I continued, "Now that the debt is settled, let's talk about the grudge. To save money and leave, I worked at a friend's shop. To drive me away, you smashed my friend's store, broke my leg, and even threatened to cripple both my legs. If you hadn't wet yourself back then, maybe I'd be just like you now, with both legs broken. Elena, there's only hatred between us now." Elena opened her mouth, wanting to say something but unable to get the words out. She resented me for not saving her even though I had been reborn, but she couldn't voice those thoughts. I understood what she was thinking, but I just sneered. If I saved her, she'd blame me, if I didn't save her, she'd still blame me. There was simply no reasoning with her. Elena was filled with grief and indignation. The three children still wanted to stay, kneeling and begging me, "Dad, we know we were wrong. We shouldn't have laughed at you with Mom. Dad, please forgive us. Now we're hungry and cold every day. Yes, Dad, you love me the most. You can't just abandon us." I didn't soften my heart. They were all ungrateful wolves, what use was there in keeping them? When Elena and I divorced, they were old enough to understand. Who was right and who was wrong, didn't they know in their hearts? But now, they still came with Elena, trying to force my hand with public opinion. Once I spent money to avoid disaster for the sake of my reputation, or even took them back to raise them again, they could change their lives and continue enjoying comfort with me. For their own benefit, they could hurt me without mercy. Even knowing they had already wronged me, they would still do it. These children truly have no conscience. Moreover, I am now married and have a daughter. If I were to bring them back, there's no guarantee they wouldn't harm the infant in the cradle. I have no reason to invite trouble into my home. There's a saying that goes, the copy is just like the original. My marriage to Elena was a mistake from the very beginning. She looked down on me, and so did the child she bore. I gave them chances, but they didn't cherish them. They brought this upon themselves, so they have no one to blame but themselves. Although public opinion was fierce, they had no grounds to stand on and couldn't compete with me. It didn't cause much of a stir, and my life remains peaceful and happy. Chapter 6. In the end, Elena failed to gain any advantage from me and had to return home in disgrace. The old family house had already been taken away, and they now live in a rented place, with the entire home feeling empty. Gone were the drunken curses of Adrian, and the sounds of things being smashed. Ever since Adrian had squandered the family's wealth, there had been daily chaos of smashing and shouting. He would often pick fights, hitting her and the children, forcing the kids to go out and work to earn money. Sometimes, as she looked at Adrian, drunk and slumped by the bed, his mouth reeking of alcohol and smoke, his greasy face, and his hair clumped together in sticky strands, she suddenly felt a wave of disgust. Stripped of the halo of a literary youth, he was just an ordinary man full of lies. How had she been so bewitched, seeing him as the moon in the sky? Was it all because he had once folded a paper rose for her? But Cairo had planted an entire garden of roses for her. Even in her past life, when Cairo saw her staring wistfully at the roses outside the window, he had specially hired a master gardener to design a garden so she could enjoy flowers all year round. She smiled bitterly. The difference was so vast, yet back then, she had thought Adrian was better. Clearly, Adrian had never truly given her anything, it was always her, one-sidedly showering him with gifts. She read many books and enjoyed the care and affection of too many people, yet she never truly integrated into society and lacked a practical understanding of the world. Cairo was her arranged marriage husband, so she thought he was utterly useless. Adrian was the forbidden love interest, so she believed her bond with Adrian was as solid as a rock. How laughable that was. She clearly knew that Cairo, in order to have common topics with her, had intermittently read many of the books she loved and even made a special effort to learn French. Yellow liquid dripped from the wheelchair, and a foul, pungent odor wafted through the air. Elena was overwhelmed with shame and anger, but she knew she had to clean herself up. Adrian wouldn't take care of her, he would only scold her disdainfully, calling her a waste of oxygen while alive, a waste of land when dead, and a waste of money in her half-dead state. Worse still, he might even resort to violence. She struggled to move her wheelchair to the bathroom to tend to herself. For someone who was partially paralyzed, handling such matters was extremely troublesome and difficult to clean up thoroughly. By the time she finished, she was drenched in sweat from exhaustion, and the sky had already darkened. She let out a long sigh. In her past life, she had never been this disheveled. Cairo had taken care of her meticulously, keeping her clean and fresh every day. She would sit in a wheelchair wearing fashionable and expensive clothes, and whenever she wanted to go out, a nanny would accompany her. For her in her past life, not being able to walk was merely an inconvenience when it came to getting around. She was still that refined and delicate young lady. To her, disability meant wearing beautiful clothes, gazing melancholically at the garden scenery from her wheelchair, or being wheeled into the living room to enjoy an elegant afternoon tea. Her privileged life shielded her from much of the pain. Under Cairo's care, her disability was nothing more than a delicate scar, it never made her feel true humiliation or suffering. She had no concrete understanding of life's hardships, which was why she had taken her own body so lightly, refusing to let others save her and insisting on giving the credit to that fraud. If she had experienced the pain of this life in her past life, would she, after being reborn, still have stubbornly refused help from others and insisted on waiting for the unreliable Adrian to save her? She closed her eyes, knowing full well that she would not. The pain brought by disability far exceeded her previous imagination. If she had known it would be so painful, she would never have risked her life for the illusory expectations of love. If she had known it would be so painful, she would have been immensely grateful for Cairo's sacrifices in her previous life. She would never have hurt Cairo for Adrian's sake, nor would she have chosen Adrian between the two of them. Adrian was nothing but scum, utterly unworthy of her taking risks for him. He betrayed her, harmed her child, and even caused her father's death. Thinking of her father, Elena's tears flowed even more fiercely. Her father had long warned her, saying Adrian didn't seem like a reliable person, and that living together was different from being in love, such a person was not fit for marriage. Yet she foolishly believed in love, acting coy and pleading with her father to accept Adrian as his son-in-law. In the end, just as her father had predicted, Adrian not only squandered half of her father's lifelong assets but also provoked him into a cerebral hemorrhage, which ultimately proved fatal. It was all her fault for inviting a wolf into the house. Elena felt a pang of bitterness in her heart. With Adrian's character, it was likely that many of the things he had said to her in her past life were lies. However, in that life, it was the innocent Cairo who paid the price for her foolishness. In this life, Cairo chose to leave, and now it was her turn to face the consequences of her own stupidity. Her father was right, Cairo was indeed a reliable man, which was why she had lived so comfortably and respectably in her past life. But there was no turning back for her now. Not only could she not turn back, but she also had to shamelessly resort to deceit just to make her life a little better. At this thought, a wave of sorrow washed over Elena. How had she become like this? When she first reincarnated, she had thought that life would be better this time around. But the reality was that she had become coarse, irritable, and haggard, often carrying a repulsive odor. It turned out that reincarnation was not a gift from heaven, but a punishment. Heaven was punishing her for her foolishness and greed. How could she have been so foolish, having spent so many years with Cairo, yet still believing Adrian's flimsy lies? She was so greedy, having already gained Cairo's companionship and affection, yet unwilling to let go of the passionate fantasies of her youth. She chose to hurt Cairo, and after he had devoted half his life to her, she kicked him aside. In truth, aside from not warning her about the car accident, Cairo did nothing. He did nothing, yet she reaped the absurd consequences of her own choices. It shows that if Cairo hadn't cared for her in her previous life, her fate would have been the same. Cairo protected her, shielding her from the pain of disability, deception, and bankruptcy. Yet, due to her own foolishness and greed, she dealt him a heavy blow at his most vulnerable moment. So, she has no right to complain about her current situation. This was always her fate, the way it should have been in her previous life. She simply didn't know how to cherish her blessings, so Cairo no longer wanted to wait. It's all her own doing. If there's any benefit to being reborn, it's that she knows Adrian will bankrupt the company. Although Adrian didn't listen to her and, just like in her previous life, acted foolishly, causing great harm to the company, at least she was mentally prepared and hid some jewelry in advance. Adrian is unreliable, and with this little money she's saved, the children will have something to rely on in the future. But she and the children could have had a beautiful life, without having to be so cautious and frugal. She smiled bitterly, used her last bit of energy to wash her hands, and went to the kitchen to make dinner. She can even cook now, something she never imagined in either of her lifetimes. If Adrian comes home in the evening and there's no food, he'll still throw things and hit people. Surprisingly, Adrian didn't return even as night fell. Seeing the 3 children hungry, Elena's heart softened. She scooped out some of the food and said to the children, "You can eat a little first." But the children didn't take it. If Adrian comes back and finds they didn't wait for him to eat together, he'll still get angry and hit people. Elena felt another wave of heartache. These 3 children were born as treasures to her and their father, given everything they wanted. When did they become so cautious and learn to read others' moods? Thinking of this, she remembered her father again. If her father were still here, if she had followed his arrangements and continued living with Cairo as in her previous life, these children would never have ended up in such a pitiful state. Although she had told her father that Cairo was not good to the children, she knew that while Cairo was strict with them, he was also very dedicated. When the eldest was born with a weak constitution, Cairo sought out doctors and remedies everywhere, even arranging a suitable nutritional diet for the child, which eventually helped the child regain health. The second child was too lively and restless, and this flaw became even more apparent after starting school. Cairo read many books on education and patiently accompanied the child in various activities, gradually correcting the child's temperament. And then there was the third child. Elena looked at her 3 children with heartache. How much damage had her foolishness brought to their destinies? She smoothed the rice in the pot with a ladle, rearranged the dishes a few times to hide any signs of having been touched, then forced a smile and said to the children, "It's fine. Mom has already taken care of it. He won't notice." Actually, she didn't give the child much food. The family was really poor now, and they couldn't make too much for a meal. If she gave too much, it would definitely be noticed, and she didn't dare. Watching the children devour their food, Elena couldn't stop her tears, which dripped straight into the rice cooker. Elena waited until midnight. Watching the children nodding off from exhaustion, she herself couldn't stop yawning. She glanced at the clock, it was already 11 p.m. Suddenly, she felt something was off. These days, Adrian had indeed been drinking outside frequently. But in this life, perhaps because he had gained the company too easily, he acted even more aggressively than in his previous life. In his past life, Adrian had been swindled in a business deal, which led to the company's bankruptcy. In this life, she tried to advise Adrian based on her memories from the previous life, but he didn't believe her at all. He even slapped her, increased his investments, and caused the company to lose even more money. As a result, Adrian was now also poor, only able to afford cheap liquor and completely unable to afford eating out. Therefore, no matter how much Adrian drank outside, he would always come back for dinner before 10 p.m. Even if he went out to drink again after the meal, he wouldn't return too late. But today, the situation was a bit unusual. Just as Elena was filled with confusion, her eldest son suddenly spoke up, "Mom, why don't you secretly sell 1 or 2 of the jewelry pieces you've hidden away? The doctor warned back then that you need to take your medication regularly, or else the incontinence will only get worse. You've been off your medication for almost half a year now." Looking at her son's troubled expression, Elena felt a wave of sorrow wash over her. Yet, in that very moment, a sudden flash of insight struck her mind, and a terrifying thought emerged. She felt dizzy, nearly fainting on the spot. Seeing her in such a state, her 3 children quickly gathered around, anxiously asking, "Mom, what's wrong?" Elena forced herself to stay alert, looking at her 3 anxious children, but she had no mind to explain. She only said urgently, "Quick, go to the 3rd child's bedroom, that box." Elena spoke somewhat incoherently, but the 3 children still understood her meaning. In the youngest daughter's bedroom, the box contained the jewelry left to Elena by her mother, their last hope. Sure enough, in the youngest daughter's bedroom, the few clothes in the wardrobe had been thrown on the floor, and the thin blankets used to cover the box were scattered nearby. Seeing this, the 3 children burst into tears. Elena bit her lip until it bled, barely managing to steady herself and prevent herself from fainting again. She was unwilling to believe what was before her eyes. Moving closer, she saw that the cabinet had been pried open, and everything inside had vanished without a trace. The last shred of hope was completely shattered at this moment. Elena's lips trembled, and it took her a long time to cry out in grief and indignation, "You're not human." Long before the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, Elena had already become wary of Adrian. She quietly hid away some jewelry, thinking that if she could divorce Adrian in the future, these items would ensure the basic survival of herself and her children. Unfortunately, she had been completely unsuspecting of Adrian before and was willing to tell him everything, so Adrian had likely already guessed that she still had something left. Naturally, Elena would not hand these things over to Adrian, and Adrian would frequently feign poverty in front of her to test her. However, she always gritted her teeth and insisted she had nothing. She had thought that Adrian, as a stepfather, wouldn't casually enter her youngest daughter's room, so she hid the box in her daughter's wardrobe, covering it with the family's quilts and the few clothes her daughter owned. A few days ago, Adrian began pressuring her to cause trouble for Cairo, hoping to squeeze some money out of him. She really didn't want to appear so pathetic in front of her ex, especially since Cairo, like her, was a reincarnator. Showing her destitution in front of him would be tantamount to admitting her own foolishness and the mistakes she had made in her previous life. However, Adrian refused to give up, constantly pressuring her and even resorting to violence a few times. Unable to bear it any longer, she reluctantly followed Adrian's instructions and took the 3 children to visit Cairo. She had originally thought Adrian was after Cairo's money, but now it seemed he was actually targeting her own savings. The demand for money from Cairo was just a pretext, the real goal was to send her and the children away so he could steal the jewelry. Now, as expected, Adrian should have run off with the jewelry, just like in the previous life, using shame as an excuse to flee. Elena collapsed to the ground, wailing uncontrollably, feeling as though everything was over and all hope was lost. Chapter 7. The arrival of my ex-wife did not affect my mood. Their current strength is far too weak to pose any threat to me. I returned home and looked at my daughter's fair, tender face, filled with joy. After changing my clothes and carefully washing my hands, I walked over and picked up my daughter Claire, saying, "Sweetheart, did you miss Daddy?" My wife smiled helplessly and said, "You've been gone for less than a day. Why would she miss you?" At that moment, the entire room was filled with a warm and cozy atmosphere. My life continued comfortably like this, yet I never expected that one day I would encounter an unexpected person, Adrian. At a business banquet, while I was toasting and chatting with business partners, an older female CEO named Lydia approached me. She started discussing our company's newly launched project and expressed interest in collaborating. Lydia's company is a leader in the industry, so her invitation was something I naturally welcomed. However, the male companion beside her looked somewhat familiar, and I couldn't help but take a few extra glances. He noticed my unusual behavior and asked, "What's wrong, Cairo? If you like this type, I can introduce you to a few, or you could even have this one." I was startled and quickly waved my hand, joking that I didn't have such strong time management skills and that he shouldn't get me into trouble. Then I explained, "Please don't misunderstand. I just thought this person looked familiar, but I couldn't quite remember who he was." Just as I finished speaking, I saw the other person also look up at me, a trace of barely concealed ferocity and resentment in their eyes. This made me even more certain that I must know this person. At the banquet, the other male and female companions kept their heads down to avoid trouble, avoiding eye contact with other guests. But this person not only looked at me on their own initiative but also seemed as if they wanted to devour me whole. Clearly, Lydia also noticed the unusual behavior of her companion. She raised her hand and slapped him, saying sternly, "Who told you to move recklessly? Apologize to Mr. Cairo immediately." Although the slap wasn't heavy, being hit in front of me still made the other person feel immense shame. His eyes reddened, and he gritted his teeth as he apologized, "Mr. Cairo, I'm sorry." Hearing his voice, I finally recognized him as Adrian. I remember Elena used to like intellectuals and scholarly types, so he deliberately put on a clean and refined appearance. That's why I didn't recognize him at first with his dyed hair and ear piercings. Who would have thought his career path would be so vertical? There was no need for me to cover up his dirty secrets. I smiled and looked him over, saying, "It's you. I really didn't recognize you." Lydia asked in surprise, "You two actually know each other?" Adrian immediately grew nervous. "Lydia, don't listen to his nonsense." As soon as the words fell, a sharp slap echoed, and Adrian received another heavy blow. Lydia scolded sternly, "Do you understand the rules? Who gave you the right to interrupt? How dare you say Cairo is talking nonsense? Watch out, or I'll tear your mouth apart." Now it's perfect, both sides of his face are evenly matched. Adrian, having been slapped twice in front of me, was so furious he lost his composure and blurted out, "Cairo, what's so great about you? Back in the day, weren't you just like me, lining up to live off Elena? Now you're just a bit luckier, that's all. If I had that kind of luck, I could do it too." Lydia's company is a leader in the industry, but she doesn't want to make enemies for no reason. She frowned and shot Adrian a glare, then said to me, "Cairo, I'm really sorry about today. I'll treat you to a meal later and make sure to give you a proper explanation." Adrian shivered under Lydia's accusatory gaze. I smiled and said it didn't matter, as this matter had nothing to do with Lydia. Adrian has always been a harsh person, barely able to keep up appearances when he was living off others. As soon as he saw me, someone who was once on a similar level but has now achieved more than him, he couldn't keep up the act any longer. Curious about Adrian's outburst, Lydia asked, "How did you two know each other before?" "I don't know what's gotten into him today, but he seems unusually agitated." Adrian's gaze toward me carried a hint of a plea, one he himself barely noticed. For someone like him, meddling in an employer's affairs is the last thing he should do. When he was with Elena, he not only interfered but also drove her family into bankruptcy. If this dark history were to come to light, Lydia would never let him off the hook. As for me, I had no intention of letting him off easily. A faint smile touched my lips as I spoke clearly, word by word, "This person is my ex-wife's second husband." After the commotion caused by my ex-wife, the details of my previous marriage spread within our circle. While people weren't entirely clear on the specifics, they all knew that my previous marriage ended because my ex-wife's tutor forcibly intervened. Moreover, when I left, this person and my ex-wife humiliated me. More importantly, shortly after I left, my ex-wife's family went bankrupt due to this person's meddling. Upon hearing this, Lydia was shocked, and her gaze toward Adrian immediately changed. Relying on looks and emotional value to earn money might not be the most positive approach, but at least it didn't harm others. However, forcibly intervening in someone else's marriage and humiliating the original spouse in such a manner was utterly despicable. Besides, Lydia was somewhat superstitious about luck. Seeing Lydia's expression, Adrian panicked and defended himself, saying, "Lydia, it's not like that. He has a grudge against me and is deliberately trying to sow discord and frame me." Lydia slapped him across the face again, angrily retorting, "If Cairo wanted revenge on you, he could have just told me directly. Would I have risked offending him for your sake? And as for framing you, do you even deserve him making up lies about you?" Adrian stammered, unable to come up with any words to defend himself. Lydia gave him a look of disgust and said, "How unlucky. So you've actually ruined someone else's company before." She then called over her bodyguards and pointed to a private lounge nearby meant for guests to rest in. "Drag him in there and beat his mouth to a pulp." Two bodyguards quickly stepped forward, grabbed Adrian by the arms, and forcibly dragged him into the lounge. These small lounges were designed for banquet guests to rest or have private conversations. They weren't spacious, but the soundproofing was excellent. However, one of the bodyguards was sharp enough to leave the door slightly ajar, leaving just a narrow crack. Soon, the sound of slaps against flesh could be heard from inside the lounge. Lydia calmly took out a handkerchief to wipe her hands and remarked, "So he's actually a jinx, yet he dared to claim he's been a lucky star since childhood. How dare he lie to me, he must have a death wish." After wiping her hands, she looked at me and said, "Since you have a grudge against this person, I'll leave him to you to deal with as you please. I won't interfere anymore." She made it sound as casual as tossing away a burden, even though she was clearly doing me a favor. I took note of this kindness and thanked Lydia with a smile. After a while, Adrian was dragged out of the private room, his face swollen like a pig's head. There was no shortage of ice at the banquet, so I had someone bring some to help Adrian reduce the swelling. He glared at me with venom in his eyes and said, "Do you think a small favor like this will make me stop hating you? Cairo, you ruined my plans this time, but if I ever get the chance, I won't let you off." His words were too long, and the movement aggravated the injuries on his face, making him gasp in pain. I said with a smile, "You won't let me off in the future. Well, you'll need to have a future first. And by the way, who said I gave you ice to calm you down? I was just worried you might have trouble going out later. Oh, I forgot to tell you, Elena reported the jewelry you stole from her 3 years ago a long time ago." A flicker of panic crossed Adrian's face. My smile widened. As a law-abiding citizen, of course I have to report a fugitive to the relevant authorities when I come across one. As soon as the words left my mouth, Adrian's face turned deathly pale. He abruptly stood up, trying to make a run for it. But the bodyguard wasn't about to let him escape right under his nose. He grabbed Adrian, yanked him back, and pinned him down with a foot, holding him firmly in place. Adrian trembled in fear, a yellow liquid trickling down his pants, and an unpleasant odor quickly filled the air. I couldn't help but roll my eyes, thinking, birds of a feather flock together. No wonder I never fit in with them, it turns out I just don't wet my pants. I guess I was the one who was out of line in my past life. Adrian, disregarding his own disheveled state, pleaded desperately, "Cairo, I beg you to let me go. I promise I'll never oppose you again. If you release me, I swear I'll never appear before you in this lifetime." He had deceived more than just Elena. If caught, it was inevitable that one thing would lead to another. Once his past crimes were uncovered, who knew how long he would have to spend in prison? Seeing him cry with tears and snot streaming down his face, I wrinkled my brow in disgust. The law is clear. Stop your whining. Adrian still refused to give up and continued to wail. I had no choice. I was so poor back then that I had to do it. If you let me go, I can compensate Elena. I was getting a bit impatient and said, "What are you mumbling about? What excuses are you looking for? Don't waste your effort. The law is fixed, and you won't get away with it." After the staff arrived and took Adrian away, I couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. Having lived 2 lifetimes, I finally realized that this schemer, who had tricked me into a miserable death in a nursing home in my previous life, was nothing more than this. As long as I don't recklessly show kindness or soften my heart toward those who don't deserve it, he has no opportunity to take advantage and no chance to hurt me through Elena. I let out a soft, cold laugh. So, in my previous life, I actually fell into the hands of such a petty person who had neither ability nor courage. Later, I heard that the staff had notified Elena and even told her that it was my report that led to Adrian's capture. Elena had asked the staff to arrange a meeting to thank me in person, but I refused. I only wanted to get revenge for myself, not intentionally help Elena. If possible, I didn't want her to benefit from my actions either. Elena asked several times, but I ignored her. Later, she somehow managed to send me a letter through someone, saying she wanted to apologize. I couldn't be bothered to read it and threw it straight into the trash. However, Elena didn't receive full compensation. In my past life, I had collected evidence of Adrian's crimes and knew he had deceived more than just Elena over the years. This time around, I didn't waste the efforts from my past life. Through targeted actions, I quickly found other evidence of his crimes. In fact, many people had reported him, and now that Adrian has been arrested, the money and luxury items in his possession will be auctioned off to compensate the victims. In the end, Elena only received a small portion of the compensation. But all of this has nothing to do with me anymore. In this life, without me to feed off of, one of them is imprisoned, and the other is downcast and haggard. Both have returned to their rightful places, their fates realigned. As for me, I continue to enjoy my new life. Chapter 8. In the days that followed, our lives went very smoothly. As we spent more time together, I discovered that although my wife spoke gently, she was very firm inside and had a great way of educating our children. We worked together to raise our child to be both intelligent and sensible. Our daughter Claire grew day by day, and under our careful guidance, she began to get involved in company affairs at a very young age. My wife often said that the mature way our daughter handled things was very much like my own style. Over time, I no longer minded bullying the child and often asked our daughter to help us with some tasks. Fortunately, she completed them very well every time. So later, we had a second daughter and a younger son, but our favorite was still the eldest daughter. As our daughter grew older, I began to have some parental concerns. When she reached the age of dating, like many of her peers, she didn't pay attention to those of the opposite sex who grew up with her and were from similar backgrounds. Instead, she always preferred to find unfamiliar partners who came from humble origins but were considerate. This couldn't help but remind me of the situation with my ex-wife and Adrian. Although I found it unpleasant, as a father, I had to seriously consider and guard against it. However, I couldn't speak too harshly about matters of love, fearing it might provoke her rebelliousness and make her even more determined to act recklessly. It was only then that I understood why Theodore had insisted on making me his son-in-law back then, even though Elena strongly opposed it and he still wanted to bring us together. How could parents not plan deeply for their children? But my difficulty in guarding against it was much greater than Theodore's back then. Elena was spoiled, Theodore couldn't bear to let her work hard, so he focused on cultivating me, while for Elena, he only hoped she would be happy. As a result, Elena didn't understand most of the company's affairs. Most of the time, she either stayed at home as a full-time daughter or went out to host book clubs and salons with her girlfriends. With so much time spent at home, Theodore had many opportunities to persuade her. If it weren't for Adrian taking a different path, perhaps Elena would have indeed followed Theodore's wishes, living a respectful and harmonious life with me, enjoying wealth and honor. But my eldest daughter is different. Her mother and I often ask her to help with small tasks, which has raised her to be wild and always running out. After graduating, she started her own business and has been running around outside all day. Out of 30 days in a month, she sleeps away from home for 26 days, more diligent than clocking in for work. She's nowhere to be seen all day, and I don't even know when would be a good time to persuade her. Finally, what was bound to happen arrived. On this day, I returned home and saw my daughter, who was rarely at home. Before I could even feel happy, I heard a piercing voice, "Hello, Uncle." My heart skipped a beat, and I didn't dare open my eyes, hoping this was just an illusion. I looked at my daughter and asked, "Claire, who is this?" My daughter said with a face full of joy, "Dad, this is my boyfriend. Kyle." My heart sank, but I hadn't completely lost hope yet. My wife and I exchanged a glance and, as usual, entertained the guest with neither warmth nor coldness. After a brief chat, my daughter noticed our somewhat indifferent attitude and pulled the boy with lemon-yellow hair into her study. I wasn't at ease, so after a short while, I quietly went to the room next to the study, wanting to hear what my daughter and that Kyle were talking about. There was a very small hidden window between these two rooms, allowing one to hear sounds from the opposite room and see each other. When my daughter was little, she liked to play while studying, so she would secretly talk and exchange cards with her second sister through this window. Later, when we found out, we locked the adjacent room and strictly enforced the rule that chatting and playing were only allowed during breaks and leisure time, while studying required full concentration. However, I kept the key, so I could open it any time. Kyle was looking around my daughter's room with a curious expression, and my daughter patiently answered his questions. After a while, Kyle casually remarked, "I didn't expect your family to be so wealthy. Your parents' careers seem to be quite successful as well." My daughter glanced at him and replied calmly, "Oh, the group was founded by my dad." Kyle's tone was somewhat excited. "Really? So all of this will be yours in the future, right?" My daughter replied calmly, "My parents don't have just me as their child. Besides me, there are also my younger sister and brother." Kyle's tone remained excited, "But you're their first child, and you're so capable. Surely you'll get the biggest share, right?" Through the gap in the curtain, I saw my daughter's fine eyebrows twitch slightly as she asked, "What are you trying to say?" Kyle walked over to his daughter and said, "Claire, don't worry, I won't let you work too hard. When your uncle and aunt get old, I can help you manage the group." The room fell silent. After a while, his daughter asked again, "Is there anything else?" Kyle continued, "And your Chingha company, I can also help you manage it. By then, you won't have to work so hard anymore, you can just enjoy life at home." My heart sank instantly. How was this any different from Adrian back then? As soon as Adrian married Elena, he set his sights on her family's business and quickly drove it into bankruptcy. Now Kyle dares to make such a request, not only coveting my daughter's Tsinghua company but also eyeing my group, and my daughter didn't even voice any opposition. I feel quite disappointed, wondering if this daughter might be a hopeless romantic. If that's really the case, I'll have to reconsider the distribution of my assets. However, I quietly left the room, planning to talk with my daughter a few more times and give her a chance to grow. I hope she won't let me down. I'm not sure how much time passed, but Kyle left, while my daughter remained in the study. Unsure of what they discussed afterward, I waited a moment before knocking. "Claire, may Dad come in?" After entering the room, I saw my daughter working on something on the computer. She looked up with a smile and asked, "Dad, what did you want to talk to me about?" I gathered my thoughts and said, "Sweetheart, your dad has been through this age too. I know when you're in love, you can't help but make compromises for the other person, even willing to give everything you have to them. But..." Before I could finish, my daughter sharply exclaimed, "Dad, what are you talking about? What do you mean by, willing to give everything to the other person? How can you say that?" I asked, "That Kyle said he wanted to help you manage Tsinghua company, and you didn't even object." My daughter grew anxious and, without even asking why I had eavesdropped on their conversation, quickly explained, "I just wanted to hear how many more unrealistic ideas he had. Dad, I may be blind, but I'm not stupid." My daughter was as agitated as a firecracker and even ran up to me, pointing to her eyes. "Dad, look at these dark circles. I've put so much effort into building Tsinghua company, how could I just hand it over to someone else?" I hesitated for a moment and said, "You're wearing makeup, so I can't really tell. But none of that matters now." My daughter's intense reaction reminded me of a story. There was a father who asked his child to earn 10 coins. Other family members doted on the child and secretly gave him 10 coins, telling him to pretend he had earned them himself. That evening, the child handed the money to his father, who threw it into the fire without even looking and told the child to go earn it again the next day. The child didn't understand, so the next day, he took another 10 coins from his elders and pretended he had earned them himself. This happened several times until the family finally understood the father's intention and let the child earn the money on his own. The child worked hard all day, helping others chop wood, fetch water, and tidy up, and finally earned 10 coins. This time, when the father tried to throw the money into the fire again, the child rushed over to stop him, risking being burned, and cried, "Father, please don't throw this money away. I earned 5 coins chopping wood, 3 coins fetching water, and 2 coins tidying up today. I earned every bit of this myself." The father smiled with relief and said, "Good child, I know this time you earned the money yourself. Things given by others are hard to cherish because no effort was put into them. Things earned by oneself are always treasured, as they are the fruit of one's own sweat." The crisis was averted, and I breathed a sigh of relief. My daughter said helplessly, "You really have quite the imagination," saying, "I'd give everything I have to the other person. What's the difference between that and being a fool?" I was amused by my daughter's words and thought to myself, you're still young and haven't seen it, but in my past life, I've seen women who were willing to sacrifice everything for love, and I was even ruined by one of them. After this false alarm, I've come to realize some truths. Raising a child, taking her out to spend money is, at best, a secondary priority. Cultivating her ability to carve out her own path in the world is the most important thing. No matter how brilliant a parent's career may be, or how magnificent and spacious the utopia they create for their child, it's all useless. If Elena had achieved something on her own, she wouldn't have handed over her family's business to Adrian so easily. After I left, she wasn't rescued in time after the car accident, and her family's business gradually declined. If she could have been self-reliant, or if she hadn't handed the business over to Adrian, she could have lived comfortably off the family's wealth and wouldn't have fallen into such a miserable state. What brought her to rock bottom wasn't her unfaithfulness, but her naivety and immaturity. In love, she became nothing more than a decorative pillow, beautiful on the outside but hollow inside, and naturally couldn't withstand the schemes of a professional conman like Adrian. I shook my head, no longer thinking about her, and asked my daughter, what were you doing just now? Is the company that busy? Is there anything Dad can help with? My daughter smiled awkwardly, no, it's just. I wanted him to earn more money before, so I made him my assistant and gave him a director's salary. Of course, the company only paid him an assistant's salary, and I made up the difference. Now that he's so ambitious, I naturally can't keep him. I just had the company fire him immediately, and the severance pay will serve as a breakup fee. I nodded with satisfaction. You've handled everything well, so Dad can rest easy. You have no idea how much mental preparation I just went through, worried you might rebel and not listen to my advice. Turns out you had it all planned out. Claire said helplessly, Dad, have a little confidence, will you? Who can't be a boyfriend? You're my one and only dad, the limited edition. You need to be more assertive. I sighed inwardly, thinking, is this what it feels like to be a dad to a normal child? It's wonderful. I then asked, and what about your company? Is there anything Dad can help with? Claire's eyes lit up. Yes, Dad. I have a project right now and would like to discuss it with Uncle Michael, but I don't feel comfortable approaching him directly. What do you think? I readily agreed and even offered to support her financially if needed. Claire's eyes lit up even more upon hearing this. I heard that Kyle tried to contact Claire several times afterward, but when Claire truly didn't want to see him, he couldn't get near her. Once, Kyle rushed to my doorstep, shouting in the rain, begging Claire to see him one more time and apologizing repeatedly. Although I later had someone warn him, and Claire's life returned to peace, that rainy plea left Claire utterly disgusted. She finally understood a truth: an ex can just be an ex, or they can become a criminal record. After experiencing such a disgusting situation in her love life, Claire devoted more time to her company's business and achieved remarkable results. Watching her career flourish, I felt immensely relieved. She is not the apple of my eye, she is the pillar of our family. A few more years passed, and Claire developed a mutual attraction with the son of one of my business partners. They hit it off and started dating again. My wife and I met the boy and felt that both of them were strong-willed individuals. We estimated that this time, they might actually make it to marriage. We were all quite satisfied. After all, a strong-willed mind is more capable of stabilizing a marriage and ensuring happiness than love alone. I smiled and picked up the calendar, intending to see if there were any auspicious days for a wedding next year. Though the past may have grown dim, the rest of my life is bound to shine brightly. I am immensely grateful to fate for giving me a second chance, allowing me to experience a normal life after letting go of Elena.